Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to The Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime. Today, you're going to meet a man that lived, ate, breathed, and slept the mafia and is in no small part responsible for the total dismantling of the Genovese crime family, at least as it was known in its heyday. It is a shell of its former self, and a big part of that is because of Mike Campi, former FBI agent and the author of the new book that everybody is talking about, Mafia Takedown, the incredible true story of the FBI agent who devastated the New York mob. Mike, thanks so much for joining me on the radio. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Frank.
When did you first begin investigating the mob?
Well, I spent 2 years in a small office division in the middle of the country after getting through new agents training class. And then in 1985, I was transferred to New York, which you got paid the same in Mississippi as you did in New York. So there was a big attrition issue back then before they came up with the cost of living. But I was assigned to a labor racketeering squad. And at that time, there was bugs up regarding corruption with the Mason Tenders Union. So there was a whole bunch of locals, Peter Vario, Local 46, Peter Vario, Local 66, Basil Cervone. So that was the first taste of organized crime. And it was, about 4 years doing that. And then it evolved where we became a squad focused on, well, initially it was the Colombo family. And at that time, I opened an investigation. I wanted my own case. We had what's called control files. I went through the history of the control files, and I figured that Carmine Sess and Bobby Zambardi were a good target because they seemed to evolve quickly from being, bank burglars to made members. And Carmine Sessa then escalated to the consigliere. But after 8 months, they took 3 guys from my squad and transferred them to another squad, and that squad jointly investigated the Colombo and Bonanno families. So the Carmine Sessa investigation went with Chris Favo, competent agent who facilitated not only numerous convictions, but Carmine Sessa's cooperation. And I went from Colombo to Genovese, and I did the same thing with the Genovese family. I went back and reviewed what's called the control files, where you have information from various sources and history. And I then decided, going from historic up to the present time, that Nicky the Blonde Frustacci, who was from 11th Street and First Avenue, would be a good target because he was well liked by both Fat Tony Salerno and Chin Gigante. And he was placed to oversee Jimmy Ide as the acting consigliere. So that is what my focus was, and that resulted in convictions of Nicky, and Jimmy Ide is doing life in prison for that investigation. So that also included the acting administration that was indicted. Barney Bellomo pled guilty, went to prison for 10 years. He's now the official boss of the Genovese family.
So take us through exactly what your role was, both with the Colombo family and the Genovese family. I know you have a nice quote endorsing your book from Jack Garcia. He was a very famous undercover agent. We've spoken with other undercover agents before, and I think most people have seen the film Donnie Brasco. Just so folks know, though, you were not undercover, right?
No, that's correct. I wasn't undercover. So when I conduct investigations, when I wanted my own investigation, again, it was who am I going to target? Who am I focused on? Because every day they're involved in criminal conduct. Every single day. You just have to figure out what they're talking about when it's cryptic. And when you have unknown males meeting with the people that are focus of your investigation, identifying, well, who are those unknown males? Because there's got to be some business, and what's the business, the nature of the business. And that's what I typically did, is focus on a group of individuals. And as that group, I was conducting surveillances, it would expand to include other associates. And in that process, I would develop informants and cooperating witnesses just by, I think, being just upfront and authentic with them and having them, the comfort zone of them realizing what I'm saying that I'm going to do, I am going to do. And so that facilitates, in some instances, additional evidence, additional informants, additional cooperation, and the interests of prosecutors, because prosecutors are also, they're not typically career prosecutors. And so you want to get their attention based on the evidence you present to them for a future prosecution.
Obviously, one of the most bold-faced names of the 20th century in terms of organized crime was Vincent Gigante, the boss of the Genovese crime family. A lot of people remember Vincent Gigante from walking around the village with his daughter wearing the bathrobe, doing this act where he acted as if he was crazy, when now we know that it was just that. It was an act. You exposed Vincent Chin Gigante's insanity defense as a fraud. How difficult was that to prove, and what was his reaction when confronted with what you determined was the truth?
Well, again, the book focused on recordings that we made with a cooperator, Michael Cookie Durso. And Durso was extremely bright, tough kid from Brooklyn. And he had previously got shot in the head and was not allowed to retaliate. The book provides the details, but there was a second bizarre episode involving Durso that facilitated his cooperating, actually reaching out to me to cooperate. And that's in the book. It's basically the acting boss, Frank Serpico, who abused Durso, actually, and Durso was in the right, as opposed to, and again, it was, the underlings didn't want to push back on Serpico because he was the acting boss at that time. But from a focus of making recordings with Durso, we knew through various members, including Patty Falsetti, Tommy Cafaro, who was Fish Cafaro's son, and others, Sammy Meatballs, that Chin was still running the show from prison. And his conduit would be his son, Andrew, and others, as far as communicating to the crew what was required and what they were doing. And so a lot of that made it simple because I had all these recordings. I figured Chin's in prison. There's a comfort zone of guys in prison. And I thought, let's pull the prison calls after 9/11. But again, it was like, let's get 6 months of prison calls. But the prison calls included Chin calling his family on 9/11, September 11th, after the World Trade Center bombing. And you could see that they had not been aware, the family was unaware of the planes crashing into the World Trade Center. So his competency clearly came across, and the details of this pretending to be crazy for, decades, cost the government money to prove his sanity. And so we charged him, and we charged Andrew Gigante. We could have charged others. The priest lied, his brother. And so that whole process exposed Chin, and really Chin took a guilty plea to protect his blood family. And Andrew pled guilty. And so, there was no way to me. It would be like me speaking to you now. He was talking in an articulate manner to his family. It was clear he wasn't crazy. And all the past hearings would demonstrate, your doctors that were testifying about his competency, all that would have been exposed. So
and
there's a lot there.
Just for the sake of clarity, just so people don't confuse NYPD detectives with Colombo crime family leaders, you were talking about Frank Persico, not Frank Serpico, right?
No, I was talking about Frank Farby. Serpico was the acting boss of the Genovese family back in when Durso was making recordings like 98, 99, 2000.
There was a Frank Serpico and a Frank Persico?
No, not Frank Persico. No, I'm talking about Frank Serpico. Frank Farby Serpico was the acting boss of the Genovese family. And he was a guy from uptown Bronx originally who was tight with Mario Gigante.
Gotcha.
And,
okay.
Not
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying that, because obviously folks know Frank Serpico from the movie, The NYPD Detective. I appreciate just getting it straight in my own head.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But D.C. politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.
So let's talk about Michael Cookie Durso. He's a central figure in your story. What was it that made him such a valuable asset? And how did his quest for what a lot of people might think was personal revenge influence the success of your investigations?
Well, again, Durso was back before he reached out to me. He was being proposed for induction into the Genovese family. And his mentors included Joe Zito, who was an individual that was indicted in the original Windows case investigation. Mm-hmm. And Joe was, Joe was respected both from Uptown Fat Tony Salerno's crew as well as Chin's crew. And after Joe was acquitted, Chin supposedly wanted to make him the capo of that crew. Instead, he deferred because he figured he'd be a focus of the FBI and law enforcement because of his acquittal. And so he just stayed in the Bronx, and he recommended that Ross Ganji be the capo of the crew. So at the time, Zito was in trial or indicted for the Windows case. He operated an Italian restaurant in Little Italy called Ruggiero's. And it was, Durso was a busboy there, and his cousin Tino Lombardi was a host. And so it was Tino and Durso, that were playing cards in a social club in Brooklyn years later. And Carmine Polito and others conspired to kill him. And so they shot Durso in the head first. The gun was so close to his skull that the round, he would have been killed had it been a little further back from his skull. It sort of ricocheted down through his neck. He collapsed on the floor as though he was dead, and then they killed Tino Lombardi and then fled from the social club, thinking that both were dead and denying that they were there at the time the murder occurred. So there was a lot there. Durso survived. He could not retaliate. The book provides details of how he did have a guy, a friend, a close associate, shoot Polito in the head at the pizzeria. But again, he denied that this was his involvement. And years went by where he was making good money. He was involved as a loan shark and others, and he was a bright kid. He was making tremendous money. Sammy Meatballs respected his intelligence. Sammy Meatballs Apparel was now the soldier and acting capo who was proposing Durso to be inducted into the Genovese family. And a second incident, again, back originally when Durso was supposed to be inducted, you had multiple guys cooperating. So they postponed these inductions. They pushed them back. Because you had like Carmine Sessa, you had, you know, you had Al Diarco, you had so many guys that were cooperating, and Phil Leonetti. It's just, I don't know how many, Sammy the Bull Gravano. So they pushed back the induction ceremony. The second incident involved, in the book details, Durso had bettors at an office. And the guy who was taking the bets was this guy, Johnny Zero, believe it or not, that was his true name. And he noticed a pattern of guys that Durso had betting there that continuously lost. And so rather than record the bets, he put them to the side thinking that he would just collect this money on his own. In this 1 week, these bettors hit, 2 of them, I believe. And so it was approximately, I think, $30,000 or so. And when Durso went to collect, Zero, who Durso liked, shared the details, and Durso realized from a street sense he may have thought it was pretty sharp to make this extra money on the side. So he gave him a few weeks to come up with the money to pay him. Zero duplicated that, and they won hit again. And so now it was around 60 or 70,000 that was owed to Durso. And so Zero says, I don't have the money. So Zero puts his boss on at the phone, and the boss at that time was named Castellano. So he assumes it's a Gambino-run office. So he demands the money, and he gives, slaps Zero around for the Castellano to hear. Castellano directs him to the location to pick up a portion of the proceeds, saying they'll pay it. And as is on his way to collect the money, actually he collected the money, he gets a call from an unknown person on his phone. And this unknown person, in a disrespectful tone, is telling Durso, you can't hit my guy. Don't you ever strike my guy. And in an insulting manner, and directs him to have his old man, meaning Sammy Meatballs, meet him up at a restaurant up in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. So Durso, furious, goes back to the Zero's office, calls the unknown male back, and says, I can't beat your guy. And he just continues to give him a beating over the phone. After he leaves, he gets a call, short time later, and it's Sammy Meatballs telling him to come down to Little Italy to meet with him, and don't go collect the money. And what it turned out was Alan Longo, who was acting as a street boss, communicating with the Genovese administration on the West Side and his and other OC families, just for the purpose of insulating the Genovese power. And it was Longo that told Sammy Meatballs that Durso insulted Frank Farby Serpico, who was our acting boss. And the recordings detail the fact that Sammy or everyone in the Genovese family did not know that Farby was the acting boss. That's how secretive it was. Wow. And so when Durso was explaining how he'd received the call in the logic hearing that named Castellano and affiliated thinking what Zero did was wrong and what Durso didn't do was wrong, it was sort of a logical street process. But why is the acting boss calling anybody on the phone? He's visualizing, what if it was a Title III on my phone? That would have been the stupidest thing in the world for the acting boss to do. So that whole process, but again, they were looking at Durso as just an associate. And at that time, Farby wanted Durso killed. So he wanted Sammy and Joe Zito to arrange the murder of Durso. And so they had a meeting along with Ross Ganji. Other people met with Farby to prevent Durso's murder. And that's when Durso was thinking, this is a pathetic, bizarre, hypocritical life. I didn't do anything wrong. If anybody did something wrong, it'd been Farby. And so the fact that we made recordings with Sammy saying, if I call for you, don't come, meaning they're going to want me to have you killed. And so he was thinking about, and around this time frame, I had information of a threat to Sammy Meatball's life unrelated to this from a source. At least it didn't come across as related, but a source told me about a threat to Sammy Meatball's life. I went to Little Italy to provide him with, information that had information about a threat to his life, and he wanted to cooperate or reach out to me, he can. And apparently, shortly after that, Durso met with Sammy. He could see that Sammy was nervous. He wanted to know what's up and everything. And Sammy said, I met with Campi. He goes, who's Campi? He goes, he's FBI. Durso's immediate thought was, he's with us, meaning corrupt. He said, no, he's the guy that put Jimmy Ida and Barney and Mickey Domino in prison. He's as honest as the day is long. And at that point, Durso was thinking, if he's to cooperate, how does he meet me? And so a former prosecutor, former Queens ADA, was now a defense attorney. And again, when you look at the courthouses in Lower Manhattan, they're very close to Little Italy. He was walking through Lower Manhattan and ran into a former prosecutor that charged him. She was now a defense attorney. And he spoke with her about could she facilitate a meeting with an FBI agent named Campi. And that's what evolved. And the book sort of goes into that. I'd gotten called by the Eastern District, Mark Feldman, who was the chief of the organized crime unit. And he was asking me things about what do I know about a kid named Durso. And I provided details because I had Durso and others frequenting, Tino Lombardi frequenting the social club at 171 Mulberry Street, which was controlled by Jimmy Ida. And I had a bug in there. So I had Durso on video surveillance and photograph surveillance, along with these DeCunto brothers, Tino, so many different people were there, Nicky DeBlanc, Jimmy Ida, Alley Shades Malangone, bank robbers that were in Alley Shades Crusoe. That's what facilitated the defense attorney and Mark Feldman calling me and asking me about it. And there's some fun humor in there about Feldman saying, well, I understand. Would you work? He didn't tell me that it was Durso that would I participate in a debriefing of a source, but he didn't tell me at that time it was with Durso. I got the impression it was about Durso. And then he said something along the lines of that, I understand you don't work in the Eastern District. And I cite this in the book, how I work everywhere. I work, I've had some great relationships with NYPD detectives. And I just had a frustrating time working in the Eastern District at one point. After this, working a few years with labor racketeering there, where I had enjoyed a lot of success with prosecutors. But this prior episode, it was much easier for me to cross the street into the Southern District than it would be to get in a car, go across to Brooklyn. And, bureau cars get ticketed. There's a bunch of administrative headaches with regard to parking tickets that you get all over the city. So I joked with him about, I'd work with anyone, anywhere, as long as they're working and they're not just, dicking around. So we laughed, and eventually a meeting was organized, and it involved Durso. And he pointed to me at this conference table, said, I want to work with Campi. And our first recording with Sammy Meatballs was amazing. I believe one of the first recordings we made, I think it was the first recording we made, Sammy said on tape that the Genovese, we cannot go through a devastating indictment and arrest as the last one, meaning the Ida case, because then it's over for the family. And we were only looking to go 6 months. We were only looking to go from June of 98 to December of 98, thinking that window of time we'd be able to address these bank robberies and the shooting and killing of Tino Lombardi and Durso shooting. And what happened was the conversations were so detailed, involving multiple families. Durso was pretty much so respected, even though he wasn't yet made. He was the person that they would use to facilitate resolutions and sit-downs. You had P.D. Red as the acting capo of the Genovese family after Ross Ganji got indicted and removed, and Sammy was an acting capo, but they would use Durso and bring Durso to these meetings. I mean, one of the things, he met with Billy Catolo and Jackie DeRoss and Frank Campi. And when Catolo turned up missing, we had recordings with Jackie DeRoss. Again, it facilitated life in prison for them, because Frank Campi really loved Billy Catullo, and they talked about how only one guy didn't like him. And again, it was Carmine Persico wanted his son to be the boss, the official boss, after he got out of prison. And it was just...
I just want to try and get to a few other areas if we can, just because I know there's a lot to cover here in a relatively limited amount of time. You mentioned internal and external forces trying to undermine your work. Can you elaborate on these? Were they primarily from the mafia, or did they come from within the FBI as well?
Well, that was one of the things I think me and D'Urso hit off on, because, again, I had managers that just didn't understand the organized crime life. And so when I was trying to get things done, for instance, we made a recording with Tommy Cafaro, who cited nobody's supposed to meet the tax doctor, which was a guy in Florida. And he cited how Barney Bellomo had his money offshore in the Bahamas with this tax doctor. So I was trying to create a scenario of where we could put our money with the tax doctor and identify where Barney's money was and seize money in forfeiture and money laundering charges. And so I needed to fund, come up with the funds for it. And I had, you needed a minimal amount, about $130,000 to put offshore. And so we created a scenario where we had a corrupt guy out in Long Island, and a company who's been stealing for, the longest time. And, if we could put his money offshore. And so I had an ASAC that just was an empty suit to me. It was just, incredulous with his logic, and he's disingenuous, and it just seemed like he pushed back on anything we were trying to do in a strategic manner. And initially, D'Urso couldn't understand why we're not moving quicker on the process, but he eventually came to realize that I was bumping heads with my bosses, much similar to how he was with his OC bosses. And so, the book goes to the details where, I basically described my squad was a joint task force. So when you do forfeiture, the PD gets 50% of what the government gets, federal government. So the PD offered to come up with half of the money. And my prior conversation with my ASAC was, I wish I could do it, Mike. It was just less, but I couldn't go less than 130. Well, when I had the information that the PD was willing to put up 50%, I went in with the lieutenant, and you could see the awkwardness of the ASAC because it was disingenuous. And you would have thought he'd be excited about the fact that the PD offered to pay half. Instead, you could see he was sort of furious, but we got the money. We went forward, and we conducted the transaction, met with the tax doctor in the Bahamas. It was funny. I followed him from the transaction when they gave him the money to the bank in the Bahamas. And when we arrested the tax doctor, his name is Peter Tarangello. He's a Staten Island guy. And he cooperated and provided the details. So it was one of the big compliments I received, because he said at his arrest, in the book I said, he said, "You're Campi." And apparently during his proffer and his cooperation, he cited that a few days before the arrest, Cafaro had met with Bellomo in prison and told him about the transaction with the tax doctor. And Barney apparently told Tommy, "Have him give it back. Campi will find it," not realizing Campi gave it to them. So that was a pretty good compliment. I enjoyed that.
I would imagine so. I know that this book was delayed from its original publication date. A lot of folks said that maybe the DOJ was trying to censor it. What can you tell folks about why the book was delayed? Was there any pressure from the Bureau or the DOJ to kind of stifle what you were putting out there with this?
Well, again, originally the book, D'Urso, I'd always been in touch with, and he wanted to do a book. He had a 16-year-old son, and he said, "Mike, would you support a book?" And I said, "Yeah, everything's fact-based in recordings made, so sure." And at that time, I was working on a project and a contract with a former prosecutor that was involved in the Chin trial, the original Chin trial. And so a meeting was facilitated for D'Urso's presentation to the publisher for the purpose of the book. And it was supposed to be a half-hour meeting, but the publisher got such a kick out of the interaction between the three of us. And it was a 2.5-hour meeting, I believe. And it only ended because there was another meeting scheduled. He said, look, there's so many mob books out there, but if you had the agent and prosecutor on it, that would be extremely interesting. I didn't really want to do it. So I said, let me discuss it with my family, because I didn't want to go through this reliving process with, various people I had as managers that just didn't understand organized crime. And so my family wanted me to go forward. So we went forward, and after about 2 years, we had met with people from Hollywood, and they were interested in doing either TV series and movie. And it was sort of a comical process. And then, Durso wanted me to, I thought it was about Hollywood, but he wanted something said or described that to me wasn't inaccurate. And I said, look, that Hollywood can do what they want. They're more, that's their, he said, no, I want it in the book. And so it bothered me because it wasn't factual. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. And that was when we sort of bumped heads.
I see.
And then like about a year ago, so the publisher said after that, I didn't want to disappoint the prosecutor. So I continued in the project with the prosecutor. And then a year ago, he stepped away. And so I have a 93-year-old mother, told her friends about the book. So I had to go forward with the book for that reason. And because there are things I think that Durso has that may come out later because they're all doing podcasts. So I just wanted to accurately depict how things were addressed.
Makes sense.
By me in the book. And so it's factual.
It's clear in listening to your description of your interactions with Durso that you guys had something of a rapport. You're joking around about parking spaces. You're facing the same sort of pressures from an FBI perspective and a mafia perspective. Tell me about the relationship that FBI agents may have with cooperating witnesses or with confidential informants. Sometimes we've seen that get a little bit blurred, that line, and folks get a little too close. I'm thinking of Lindley DeVecchio and Greg Scarpa. I'm thinking of John Connolly and Whitey Bulger. And as terrible as what those guys did, I can actually understand how you end up going down a certain rabbit hole in terms of fighting for a common purpose. Talk to me about that relationship from a psychological perspective.
Well, okay, so I'm as genuine as can be to my sources. My philosophy is to treat people the way I would want to be treated. And so one of the things that Durso had said, and I note this in the book, is that the wisest advice Campi ever provided me was don't ever lie to me. Because if you lie to me, I'm going to tear up the agreement. And that's the part that really I try to get across to all my sources, is to be as genuine. Because again, when I jam somebody else up and they provide information, I'll corroborate it. If I corroborate it, then your agreement gets ripped up and you get arrested. And so I've had, I think, a good relationship with sources that have made left turns at the wrong time, and the agreement gets torn up. And so Durso said that advice was the best advice he'd ever received from me. And so the being genuine and understanding the street and understanding, how treacherous it is, and being able to, walk between the raindrops with your sources can be difficult. But my investigations have arrested numerous corrupt law enforcement, including PD, attorneys, a judge, other federal agents, and even an FBI agent. And so it doesn't, to me, if I'm working on something and I come across something that is a violation of crime, it's in my investigation, I'm going to charge you. And so I think they understand that. And that's some of the best compliments I've received are coming from criminals. I can remember meeting a guy from the Bureau of Prisons the first time because he was on a joint task force. And it was a Federal Bureau of Prisons officer. And he looked surprised. He said, "You're Campi?" And I said, "Why, did we meet before?" He says, "No, I've heard, you don't know how many times I've heard your name from the inmates." And it's on, the phone calls. And so his visual of me was like somebody like olive-skinned Italian, with a full head of hair. Now I have very few hairs on my head, and my mother's from Ireland, so I don't have that Italian look. But he said he cited a call, which I thought was hilarious, was a guy on the outside was talking to an inmate, said, "I was just visited by an FBI agent named Campi," and the inmate said, "Hire an attorney and plead guilty." He said, "He didn't charge me with anything yet." He said, "Hire an attorney and plead guilty. I'll see you in a few months." And I just took it as such a compliment from the criminals, on how, I guess, the reputation
right, how
got
effective
out there,
you are.
as you do. Right.
Sure.
So, I mean, those were more, and I'd had, bosses and supervisors that in the FBI, if you have somebody that's not, doesn't want to sign off on something because of the risk of, something bad happening, you can always go over their head to their boss to get them to sign off on it. So, and that was my stubbornness as far as trying to be effective as an agent. Like I just, and the relationship with the sources is an important relationship for them to trust you, to do what you say you're going to do, and for them to honor our relationship. And a lot of times it doesn't happen. They do it on a need sometimes to get over the hump, but then eventually when you're operating them, they may make a left turn and somehow it falls out and they have to be arrested. And that's happened with some of my sources. I feel bad for some of them sometimes because they've had a tough life, growing up.
Sure, absolutely.
And so I have empathy for them. At the same time, relocating isn't in the witness protection program isn't for everybody. Some of them can't.
I've spent a lot of time analyzing, covering, attending high-profile mafia trials, and you see the investigation that goes into these trials. Obviously, I spend a lot of time discussing and analyzing what's happening on the national political scene as well. And over the last 5 or 6 years, I've noticed a similarity in what defenders of President Trump and his associates say about the criminal justice system and the DOJ, and what a lot of mafia guys and their attorneys say about the Department of Justice and the DOJ, namely that they're targeted specifically. And it was interesting what you mentioned earlier in our conversation when you said there's criminal activity going on every day. You just have to pick out who to target. Just so folks understand how this process works and how you work, did you ever go after a mafia guy because of who he was instead of what he did? In other words, the system, as most people understand it, is that when a crime is committed, you investigate, gather evidence, and find out who did it. In a lot of mafia cases, a lot of times it seems like they start with a target, investigate him for years, arrest his friends, and tell them they can walk if they implicate the target. I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to the process of going after a person rather than going after the byproduct of a specific criminal incident.
Well, so say my James Ida investigation, my process really is like when we went from labor racketeering, separate of the Colombo family, when I was the Genovese initially, I wanted to know, do they want me to focus on labor racketeering type crimes or do they want me to focus on drugs? And that's where I was figuring out, okay, if you told me drugs, let me go into that control file and pull up. And I opened an investigation on a guy, Sally Dogs Lombardi, who was very involved in narcotics. But my thought process, and again, there was a lot of overlap in investigations involving Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Sally Dogs was a high target on drugs. And one of the things I had was that if Chin caught him with drugs, he would want to kill him. So I remember seeing Sally Dogs in prison after he got arrested on another investigation. But that said, for instance, my Ida investigation, my focus was, this is the acting administration for the Genovese family, James Ida, Barney Bellomo, Mickey Michael Generoso. And so I thought, if I focus on them and I'm able to arrest them in significant charges based on whatever evidence I can collect, there's a possibility that one of them may want to cooperate because of the hypocrisy of your boss pretending he's crazy for decades to protect and insulate himself while they're getting charged with murders. And so I thought that that would be a good target. But it wasn't as though I opened the investigation because of a name or people above me directed me to conduct this investigation. It was my process to review information. And as I'm doing the case, you realize how many different people they're meeting with and the types of information that you develop in conducting interviews and what your focus is and how to collect the evidence that you can charge in a future indictment. And so it's, as you do it, it's a real learning process as far as the range of types of crimes besides murder conspiracy, labor racketeering, gambling. We did the Feast of San Gennaro. I remember Giuliani taking credit for the Feast of San Gennaro. He had nothing to do with it. And the reality was these people that operate those stands in that Feast of San Gennaro, there's so many different festivals throughout the city that they did the same thing. And so you would be able to have collected additional money that was being avoided from the city collection standpoint, because again, whoever hosts these festivals are supposedly charged 25% of what they collect from the vendors for the permit. And they just sort of fraudulently fill out applications that don't represent what's actually being collected because it's the mob. You know, they had it in the village. They have a festival in the village. They continue to have it. So there's a lot to learn. Again, when I look at how things are being investigated now in organized crime, they think it's been decimated. But when you really look back historically, how many unions are controlled by organized crime? And I compare it in a sports analogy. So your quarterback on your NFL team gets hurt. Do they play 11 against 10? No, they replace him with somebody that's not as good as the original. And that's what happens when you remove union officials.
Right. Well, you anticipated what I was going to ask you in a bit, which is the role of the mafia in the labor rackets today. How bad is it? Because I do hear from a lot of guys that the mafia is, especially in the New York area, a shell of its former self. But given the analogy that you just used in terms of replacing one quarterback for another, sounds like there may still be a lot of mob influence on the labor community.
Right. And I've been called by guys, from law enforcement, from my prior life, who have been conducting investigations in the past. And they tell me it's like back to the 70s. That,
wow. Really?
The meetings are, And these are people that I trust as far as their experience, past experience. And, it doesn't surprise me. It's, to me, like, if you don't look, you don't know. So if you're not out there conducting investigations, you're not really fully aware of what's actually going on. Barney Bellomo is now is the official boss of the family. I'm sure people in the crew, from what I understand, are in the administration from uptown Bronx, and it's not like they're just sitting on their ass. It's business as usual.
The process of flipping obviously gets a lot of criticism, namely from criminal defendants. By flipping mafia members with plea deals, are you inadvertently allowing hardened criminals to escape justice in exchange for information? How do you weigh the risk of trading one criminal for another?
So when I have genuine conversations with guys as far as cooperating, and they may take a plea, the reality is that you're not getting a guarantee. What we put before the judge is the extent of your cooperation and what you've pled guilty to. And so that cooperation may include violations of our agreement. So, for instance, if you were arrested, which, again, if you violated and committed additional crimes without any type of authority or coordination, then you're going to have a bad day with that federal judge. But if you did what Durso did, for instance, when Durso pled guilty to murder, but there's no guarantee that you're going to walk free. If you're cooperating, you get prison time in the federal system. It'll be in a protected area with other cooperating witnesses who have been criminals in the past. I mean, there's other instances where they may assault one another in the prison. But all we're going to do at sentencing is provide the judge with the details of your plea, your guilty plea, your prior crimes, because those are going to be captured in debriefings, and the extent of your full cooperation. So, for instance, if, like Durso, you're meeting every day with treacherous people, recording their conversations in a discreet manner, that puts your life in jeopardy. Matter of fact, I think it was 2 weeks into our making recordings, Sammy Meatballs, and this is in the book, directed Durso to go to his son Vinny Apparo's house. It was like 1 a.m. And so Durso called me and was on his way and was wondering, is there any possibility that they know I'm cooperating? And I was trying to delay his arrival so that I can get there. And he couldn't. He was almost there. He had to be there. And if he gets killed, if he disappears, I'll know what's involved. Well, shortly after, he calls me back, and it was because they gave him a whole bunch of guns. They were anticipating from a court order that somebody received that Vinny's house may be raided in a search warrant by feds, and they wanted the guns out. And so he delivered those guns to me the next day. And it was, it was the type of thing where, you had Ippolito Caracappa, you had Scarpa. So that, we were making recordings with Jackie DeRoss, right? And Billy Catulo. It was like, all of a sudden Billy Catulo disappears, and we're addressing in those recordings the fact that, he was killed. We actually even had a recording of a conversation where Benny Alloy, was it Benny or Vinny Alloy? I think it was Benny Alloy. Maybe it was Vinny Alloy. But they were citing how Billy Catulo's wife was contacted by Jackie DeRoss, I believe, who was asking for money that Billy had that was Colombo. And, the conversation we recorded was one where she cited in a sarcastic tone, well, when he comes home, I'll tell him that you're looking for the money he has. Meaning, she knew he was dead, killed. But there's a lot in the book, I think, that cites the hypocrisy of the life. Mm-hmm. Where your crime family is supposed to come before your blood family. If you've got 5 or 6 guys that in your life that you can trust with your life, that's one thing. But to join an organization that has 108 guys that are supposed to come before your blood family, it's just juvenile.
No, it's absurd. Of course,
associates, and they're jealous of each other. Like a little guy that may get insulted by a bigger guy. They're made, and it's done in a joking manner, but the little guy may just hold a grudge against the bigger guy and, vouch to kill him someday because of the insult that he viewed as occurring. There's just a lot of treachery.
You've called out Hollywood for glamorizing the mafia. What's the most damaging misconception the media perpetuates about the life?
Well, if they actually went back and looked at and that's in my book, I cite the hypocrisy going back to the days of original. When you look back historically, when Italians came to this country, late 1800s, 1920s, they followed the Irish and Jewish, and you had Irish and Jewish gangsters. But when you look back on Joe the Boss Masseria's murder, it was, because he didn't want Vito, and others, Costello and all, hanging around with the Jewish guys. He wanted them just Italians to Italians. So they coordinate with Salvatore Maranzano to whack Joe, the boss, with the understanding that Lucky would take over his business. And then it was months later where Salvatore Maranzano was looking to whack Lucky. And they then decide to kill Maranzano. But 36, Lucky goes to prison. And so there were so many things when you look at the 30s as viewing it where on a national level, you had the Depression, you had World War II in the 40s. So you're not going to have that understanding that there's a national Italian organization. Yeah, it's like gangs. But, I mean, when you look at it, when Lucky goes to prison, Vito Genovese becomes the acting boss. And then less than a year later, Vito flees to Italy because of being investigated for a murder. And Frank Costello becomes the acting boss. After World War II, when Vito returns, Costello and Vito are jealous of each other, which is comical. And in the book cites how at some point, again, 1951, Albert Anastasia is the underboss. He whacks his boss and consigliere, which are the Mangano brothers. And they were related to Benny Eggs Mangano, which made sense of how Benny Eggs probably ended up with the Genovese family. But that's like in 51, Albert Anastasia is doing that. And in 57, Albert is tighter with Frank Costello. And in the book, and it's never been before discussed, but this came as a result of George Barone's cooperation, historic, who was with Vito in 50. He cited how Albert Anastasia and Frank Costello met with Michael Miranda, who was the consigliere of the Genovese family, in Brooklyn restaurant to discuss and get Miranda's agreement or consent to whack Vito Genovese and replace Vito with Frank Costello. And Miranda says, let me think about it for a few days. And he goes right to Vito to tell him that they're looking to kill you. Well, what does Vito do? He asks, was there any witnesses at the meeting occurred? And Miranda cited that John Sonny Francis was there and witnessed it. And that's where that facilitated the shooting of Chin shooting Frank Costello. And, and then after that, and Costello then in the hospital acknowledged the conspiracy and said he wouldn't let Albert know that this was related to the conspiracy. And then months later, Albert was killed. So there's a lot there. And then you follow that with the Appalachian meeting, where they're discussing what occurred, the violations, of Omerta and this conspiracy to kill and why Albert was killed and Carlo Gambino's replacing it. And in 61, you have Joe Gallo, who kidnaps his underboss, Joe Magliocco, and the boss, his brother, the consigliere, Frank Pravacci, with others for money, ransom money. Now, Gallo may have been on the Albert Anastasia murder, so maybe he thought he was more powerful than that. But that's 1961. That's a violation. And then in 63, you have Magliocco, who's now the boss because Joe Pravacci died. And he's conspiring with Joe Bonanno to murder Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese. I mean, these are things I cite in the book. It's just, these are unrelated to like lower level guys that are getting killed, but this is the top.
Yeah.
Then you got Joe Gallo, or what was it, Joe Gallo? No, Joe Bonanno doing a book and then doing 60 Minutes. And then Lucky Luciano wanted to do a book before he died. I mean, there's so many things that I cite. Billy Catullo, Jackie DeRoss. Billy Catullo was Jackie DeRoss' best man. I mean, it's just kooky to me from the standpoint that you should just sort of stay away from it, because if you want to be a criminal, you could probably do better on your own.
No question about that. That's clear based on the stories you just shared and what's in the book. Lastly, Mike, if you were to, understanding your criticisms of Hollywood and the glamorization of mafia life, is there any film that you think does a realistic job depicting either the mafia end of things or the law enforcement end of things?
I don't usually watch mob movies. I mean, sometimes I remember somebody, I have some funny stories because somebody asked me what they thought my favorite comedy was, and I said Raging Bull. They said, you found that funny? I sort of did, but I do believe that that's an accurate depiction of, how they wanted to throw fights. From the standpoint, and I do, I thought The Offer, somebody told me to watch The Offer, and I thought The Offer was sort of depicting how they compelled Hollywood to sort of portray The Godfather in a very honorable manner. My book has recordings, like this is another violation, of we made recordings, Dursa with Alan Longo, about how Alan Longo and his crew were furious of their former capo, Ali Shades Malangone, because he was meeting with Elizabeth Hurley and Hugh Grant, who were filming, what was that mob movie? It was a comedy.
Mickey Blue Eyes.
Mickey Blue Eyes.
Right.
And we're making recordings with Longo in 1999. That's when the movie came out. And at an Upper East Side restaurant and at Ali Shade's bar, he was telling and explaining to Hugh Grant and Elizabeth Hurley that he was capo in the Genovese family. He was identifying the soldiers in the crew and talking about the mob to them, like openly. And it was just infuriating Alan Longo in this recorded conversation. Perfect example of the hypocrisy of that life.
Of a secret society.
And then we made another recording where the Harvard man, Sammy Meatballs, cited how Johnny Green Urso got Vinny Apparo's son and role as an actor on that movie through James Caan. And I mean, there's so many things that just, there's an influence. It makes sense because they can opportunity for somebody to generate money for the mob and portray them in even in humor, Mickey Blue Eyes.
That's wild. Mike Campi, I want to thank you for being so generous with your time. I hope people check out the book, Mafia Takedown, the incredible true story of the FBI agent who devastated the New York mob. It is a compelling bit of storytelling here, and people should absolutely check it out if they're interested in any of the stories we shared. And believe it or not, there's so much more in here. We didn't even scratch the surface. We could have done another 3 hours and still not covered everything that's in the book. Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. You have a good one. Hope everyone enjoys it. Take care.
Thank you. If you have not already done so, please be so good as to subscribe to this podcast. You could search The Racket Report on any podcast app, iTunes, Spotify, whatever. And if somebody sent you this podcast to listen to, do us a favor and pass it on. Don't keep this a secret. You do not have to adhere to the Code of Omerta. Share the wealth and share the information. And until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.